Hello, Tristan Vane.
Hello.
Nice to have you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
All right.
Now, did we have a video? Did I post? Did we have a video from last week?
Yeah, there's a video that you posted.
Okay, good. Yeah, because I was sick. I think I did it for Modesto, and I put it on for you guys as well, and it should work just the same. It's the same class. Okay, so in that case, then we are through on the study guide. We're through number 8 then, right? We should be. Everything on the War for Independence. Let's see here. All right, so what I'll do is I'm going to just jump straight to today's work. And Tristan, I'm going to give you extra credit for being able to come. So I'm not penalizing anyone for not coming, but I want to reward those who joined the meeting. So thank you. So let's see here, right? So for this week's assignment, we have our transition from our first government that didn't last very long into the federal republic that we have today, right? And so on this week's assignment, so let's see here. I want to see someone else is connecting. I want to make sure everyone gets his or her extra credit. Well, hopefully just in a moment here, then a name will pop up. But at any rate, Tristan, the assignment that you're working on this week, right? With number 1, you're looking for the way by which events they played right into the hands of the conservatives. From the very beginning, as we see today, there was a strong polarization between liberals and conservatives, and it was different then, right? With the liberals of this time period, they were getting a lot of their stuff from the Scottish Enlightenment and what we would call in 100 years from here, or not even quite 100 years, classical liberalism. And the classic liberals, they were actually libertarian, right? That government don't tread on me. They wanted government. They thought that there was an inherent part of human nature that cannot handle power, that we will inevitably abuse it if we're given too much of it. So the liberals of that time period, they wanted to keep government weak and accountable because of that distrust, right, of government. And so what they considered was that there was kind of a consensus amongst liberals and conservatives that there should not be one segment of the society. There should be not one demographic or one faction, right, a group that shares the same interests and views that should prevail over everybody. That was largely a consensus amongst liberals and conservatives. And so they were on the same page in the sense that they liked what Montesquieu had written in the Enlightenment. That okay, so I see Abdul Siddiqui. Thank you, Abdul. Nice to have you. So let's see here. There was that was kind of an agreement, a tacit agreement that they had, is that government ought to have checks and balances and have a sense of equilibrium, right? So different factions, different groups would have to share power and would have to compromise, etc. But within that type of a mixed government, so to speak, right, that Aristotle had written about, the liberals sided on having a mixed government lean more toward a democracy. Remember, demos means the people in Greek. So the democracy is the common people are running the show. And so the liberals of that time period, they weren't big proponents as much as we are today of like the collective wisdom of the common people, the sagacity, the common sense and capability of every individual within the republic. They didn't have total trust in like just democracy, period. But they thought, like Thomas Jefferson wrote and spoke, that having a government that leaned more toward a democracy was a lesser evil than having it lean more toward an aristocracy. And aristoi in Greek means the best. So ruled by like an elite, right, who are well educated and wealthy and well, quote, bred and brought up to be more, they said, capable of making wise decisions on behalf of the people and so forth. So the liberals of that time period, I think of Patrick Henry, I think of Thomas Jefferson, right? They said, you know what? If anything, governments need to lean more toward the people as a lesser evil. That true, they'll get things wrong, but their mistakes will be less pernicious. Their mistakes will be less dangerous to our liberties than will be the deliberate uh, plans of an aristocracy to strip people of their rights, etc. Right? So during the War for Independence, when we fought from 75 to 83, mainly from 75 to 81, but technically till 83, um, different states started declaring their independence, the colonies, long before we did a national declaration of independence. And in them, it was as if they were really in the mood. They were caught up in the mood of the ideas of that time period, right? With the classical liberals from Scotland who were writing, and Benjamin Franklin, Dickinson, Jefferson, and John Adams and others were writing what they were writing back in Scotland and trying to influence the people here in the colonies. And so they're really caught up in that mood, so to speak. And not to mention the Enlightenment, like I mentioned, like Montesquieu and the idea of balance of power, Voltaire with natural rights of freedom of expression for each individual, Beccaria with the rights of suspects. If you're held, you have a formal accusation, criminal accusation against you. And Condorcet and Diderot were really for the pursuit of happiness, right? They wrote encyclopedias and they said that all people have a right to cultivate themselves, educate themselves, and improve their lot, right? Not just the rich few and the nobility. So at any rate, these ideas really caught hold during the War for Independence. And so the states, right, they were arguably more democratic than they would be in some cases after the war, after we created a republic, and certainly before when they were just colonies. So they dropped property requirements for men to be able to be citizens. That had been a long political tradition in England, that if you don't own property, there must be something wrong with your initiative. You don't really have a stake in society. You don't have much to lose, and you can't be trusted. And so hence they had strict property requirements in the colonies for a white male to be able to be a citizen in 9 of the 13 colonies in the royal colonies. And so now they started dropping the requirements for at least white men to be citizens. And they one Pennsylvania even did away with the governor. They didn't like a strong executive over the people. And in the other colonies, they had governors, but they didn't have veto power like the British governors had. Okay, so Frankie Flores, thank you. So they deliberately made their governments in these states, right, during the War for Independence, weak and democratic, at least democratic relative to the past, right? Because when we think about just white men, that's not that democratic by today's standards. But relative to the past, now poor white men are getting the opportunity in many states to participate in government. And so they made their legislators popularly elected. Some of them only had unicameral, only one branch of a, or at least pushed for one branch of a legislator to make laws, and they would be popularly elected by the citizens, as opposed to having an upper branch that had checks over them, right, and could veto their laws. And so looking at number 12, that's what we're looking at for the test, is that state level democracy during and just after the War for Independence. It was relatively libertarian, smaller, deliberately weaker government, and it was relatively democratic, right? And enlightened from the Enlightenment, distrustful of governing elites. So at any rate, at this time, we formed a loose confederation, right? And a confederation to me is that every state is virtually autonomous. It's almost independent. It has its own set of laws. It even, many of the colonies even brought forth their own currency system and commercial and business laws and so forth. And they would unite only under exceptional, out of the ordinary, anomalous circumstances. If there were an invasion, right, from the Louisiana Territory, from France, or from Spain, and there need to be a time of war against Native Americans, etc. Only then could they be kind of unilaterally led by the representatives from each of the states in this somewhat federal Congress. If a law, particularly a tax law, was not passed by your elected reps in your state, it didn't apply to your state. I mean, could you imagine that now, right? Obviously, that's not in effect anymore. Whatever a majority in Congress opts for becomes law, whether we like it or voted for it or our reps were for it or not, right? It's uniformly carried out throughout the country. That was not the case under the Confederation. And so it was very weak deliberately, right? Because again, the idea was with the libertarian rhetoric that was going on at that time is that the best thing, if government is just a lesser evil, a necessary evil, the best thing is to have it not only as democratic as possible, according to the libertarians, but as a less dangerous form of government, but also to have it be accountable as possible. And I guess the idea is that when the government is smaller and more localized, that people know where their politicians live and they could hold them more accountable. They'll feel more of a sense of accountability at the state level. So they deliberately had the states almost independent during this confederation that we tried during the war and 4 years after. So it didn't last very long. The conservatives, right? They read, and like I said, there was consensus even amongst, like, John Adams was ultra conservative, for instance. And even the conservatives thought that there should be some popularly elected offices, that the demos, the commoners, ought to have a say in government, and they ought to have checks and balances over the whatever type of aristocracy is formed, right? An elite group. Nevertheless, they thought that government should gravitate more toward the aristocracy side than the democracy side. And the argument was, I likened it to, like if I ask you the question, do you believe all citizens, all human beings for that matter, from the Enlightenment, right? It was a human being thing. Do you believe all human beings are entitled to the same rights and opportunities and protections under the law? Well, as a good American, even the conservatives said yes, right? But do you believe that everyone is equally capable of writing a good English paper for you, of fixing your car, right? And of course, it's a rhetorical question. The answer to that, to the conservative said, is clearly no, right? That some people are more talented at certain things and better prepared and skilled and and cultivated to do a better job at certain things than others. So the conservatives, they took more of an elitist side in having a republic, a mixed government. And they said, well, the people ought to be able to elect reps, but not all politicians. Some politicians need to be handpicked for their education, their pedigree, and so forth. And the idea was, from the Enlightenment, is that education was somehow synonymous with cultivating you into being a better person. That it wasn't just learning an art or science in particular, like going to a vocational school to learn how to weld, but that reading the Greco-Roman classics and other things, it literally polishes you and makes you a better human being and more capable of showing wisdom as a leader. And not to mention, you can learn the laws, the so-called laws of political science and government, and be better in that resort as well. So literally in the Federalist Papers, the conservative writers wrote that elected reps ought to be filters for the common people, that the common people will have some great ideas, but they'll have some terrible and ignorant ideas, and that the reps ought to be a better sort, who are better educated and better prepared to be politicians, and they ought to weed out the poor ideas and only implement the good ideas that the people have. They also called it at that time stewardship. To me, stewardship is like a babysitter. It's trusting someone with something that is precious to you, right? And so they said they need to be stewards. The people need to trust them. They elected them into office. Now let them do their thing. They elected them for good reason. They're better prepared than the common person. They're more wise. They're more well-rounded through their education, and hence better capable of making wise, sound decisions in government. And like I said, with the libertarian liberals of that time period, they didn't like that idea, because to them, right, you can become as educated as you want. You could learn the laws of government as well as you want, but that doesn't necessarily make you into morally a good person, right? Intellectually, yeah, you're prepared, but morally, what if you use all that knowledge that you've accumulated for evil? You use it to try to slyly take rights and liberties away from the people, right? Instead of protecting them. So At any rate, the conservatives like John Adams, they were kind of disgusted with the Confederacy. They thought it was too democratic. They thought it was too decentralized and weak, right? And Alexander Hamilton, especially, with them. John Adams was more philosophical because he didn't trust uneducated people with power too much. Alexander Hamilton was more practical and less intellectual in his opposition, and just said practically we need a stronger government, just so that we don't get gobbled up by our neighbors or by European power again. That we need to become stronger. So at any rate, during this time of Confederacy, on number one, right, I focus on everything that went poorly, everything that went wrong, right? And notice how, in particular, how many of the states issued laws for easy credit, because credit, right, getting a loan to start a cash crop farm or to start a business, that was the average person's avenue to the American dream. It wasn't through education yet, because it wasn't a great educational system. We didn't have the professionalization campaign yet, where you have to have a bachelor's degree or a certificate of education of some sort to take a position of even like lawyer or doctor. And so at any rate, at this time, a lot of the people said, this is our way to the American dream. We want easy access to loans, to credit. And what happened time and time again is just things that I don't have time to get into, but just poor crop harvests, rising prices for wheat and other main commodity crops. And so things went awry for these aspiring farmers in many of the states, and many of them began losing their farms. And they defaulted on their loans. They were unable to pay their loans back. And the creditors were getting furious, the lenders, right? Because not only were they not paying it back, but because the common people had so much power in these states, they would use that leverage in their state legislature to pass laws called stay laws, giving themselves 5 more years to pay off their debts. And in a couple very controversial cases, they actually issued like liquidation laws where they just said all debts are null and void, and we no longer have to pay them back to the bankers. And of course, you don't have to be an economist to know that that is going to really hurt the economy if lenders are not giving their money back. And so, so in that sense, right, the people were acting very selfishly, very short-sightedly, and just for their own interest. The conservatives, right, they had read their Aristotle and Plato, and both Aristotle and Plato were very elitist against democracy. They thought that the common person not only doesn't have the intelligence and doesn't have the education to make wise, sound decisions, but that the average person also doesn't have the moral self-control and integrity to be trusted with power. That the average person would just be led by his appetite, they said, kind of like Freud's id, right? Like your instinctive passions. I want that, so I want to get it, right? And you make a very impulsive decision without thinking through it. So the conservatives who had read, and the liberals had too, the leaders, that is, they were classically educated in Greco-Roman education. They said, see, this is exactly what the Greeks and Romans said about too much democracy. The people are being short-sighted. They're just simply getting what they want in the short run, and they're making poor decisions in the long run that are economically harming their states, right? And then also with the Confederate part, the states virtually being autonomous or independent almost, right? Is you could easily think of what they would say with that, with the Italian city-states and the Peloponnesian League of the Greeks, is they said that they'll end up becoming jealous of and fighting with one another. And that seemed to happen as well. Pennsylvania and Virginia fought over Western frontier land and almost went to war with each other. New Jersey and New York had commercial wars where they would highly tax the commodities coming from their neighbor and make it very difficult for merchants and businessmen to cross the state border without being highly penalized with taxes to help their own, to help businessmen, merchants in their own state. And so, again, the conservatives are looking at this and saying, see, the Confederacy is a mess. They're fighting with one another. There's no unity. All it takes is just one another large invasion from Britain or someone else, and we're going to lose our independence right away. And so that's what I wanted you to look for with number one, is that um, Americans had more democratic government, and each state was more independent than they are now. Well, I say than they are now. Now with universal suffrage and citizenship, that's not the case. But you know what I mean. That those who were citizens, at least, very democratic governments and very decentralized, and they played right into the negative stereotypes that the founding fathers had read in their classical education. That see, the people will be short-sighted and hasty and rash with their decisions and greedy, and and in a confederation, the states will be at war with one another, and unity will be impossible, and it'll weaken us on behalf of other countries that might be licking their lips wanting to take us over. Okay, so that's what I try to convey on number one. It's the classic interpretation of why our democratic confederacy didn't work. That the people ruled in such a way that it played right into the negative stereotypes that the founding fathers had read about these types of government, so that the conservatives can tell the liberals, see, I told you so. We need a stronger central government, and we need, actually, ironically, less democracy. We need more unelected positions to put a check on what the people are wanting. And to people like George Washington, who are already conservative, there was an event that really supposedly was influential upon him and others in deciding we need a less democratic, more centralized government, and that was Shays' Rebellion. A guy named Daniel Shays was just one of several leaders, whereby in Massachusetts they passed several stay laws, and finally their legislator said enough is enough. You have a certain amount of time to pay back your debts, or we could foreclose on your collateral, on what you have in property, right, and assets, as proof that you'll pay it back. And so they began sending judges into these western peripheral areas of poor and vicious people, which often was a pattern in the colonies and states, that those who didn't have opportunities, they moved west. So in some of these western areas, right, when the judges came to put them under trial, and under English common law, you can not only lose everything if you've defaulted on your loans that you had up for collateral, but you could even be, for a short period, incarcerated in debtor's jail. And so when the judges came to do that, Daniel Shays and others put on their Continental Army and militia Minutemen uniforms, right, and claiming that this was like the British taking over their property all over again. And they, not just symbolically, they threatened to kill the judges, and they held them hostage. They freed some of the men from the debtors' jails, and the militia from the actual colony had to go and fight against them in this quasi-civil war in Massachusetts. And George Washington, to him, right, he said, "Good God, this is just ruled by the mob." And so Shays' Rebellion was evidently pretty pivotal in getting a lot of the founding father leaders to decide that something needed to be done, less democratic and more centralized. Okay, so any questions on that with number one on this week's assignment? And that also pertains to number 10 on your study guide. Articles of Confederation, alleged problems. So we've done number 10 for test 2, okay, as well as number 1 on the assignment. And then number 2, right, Pauline Maier, her thesis is, as you probably have noticed, it's kind of bittersweet, isn't it? Is that the bitter part is you see a very elitist side of the founding fathers. They'd already been elected in their defense as assemblymen during the colonial era, but because they'd been elected in the past, they took it when the assemblies began being shut in. The British governors of the colonies began shutting down the popularly elected assemblies because they wouldn't toe the line with England when we were having the taxes and then our mob and boycotts and struggle against them over that, right? They gave the assemblies ultimatum to toe the line and say that Parliament has the right to tax the people without the Assembly's consent. And almost without exception, the assemblies did not back down. And so they were formally shut down, and they had to meet in hiding during the War for Independence. And so they decided through committees of correspondence to join up in a Continental Congress. So they had been elected in the past, but because they were elected reps of the assemblies that were now being shut down by the British, they took it upon themselves that they had been elected, so hence they were the natural leaders to make major decisions on behalf of everyone else. So they met in the Continental Congress, right? And they decided that in a famous case, meeting in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, that they were going to scrap this confederation, and they were going to form a new constitution with a federal republic. Okay, the federal part. The federal part is supposed to be a balance between a confederacy, which I've already explained, right? Just very, very plainly, that the states are almost autonomous, right? And a unitary government. A unitary government is where the central government makes all the laws. So there's no room for city, county laws, state laws. The central government dictates everything. And of course, we don't have that either, right? We don't have a unitary government nor a confederacy. The federal part, federalism, is supposed to be a balance, whereby the central government gains more powers than under a confederacy, okay? And one of the big ones, right, is the power of the majority to rule, that whatever majority of the elected reps from each state decide upon, as far as a tax to be paid, a law to be implemented, that it doesn't matter if your local area and your locally elected rep said no to it. If a majority said yes, that law or that tax prevails in your area too, right? And so that with the federal government, the central government gets certain powers, right? And when you look in the Constitution, I think of Article 1, Section 8. Okay, Article 1, Section 8 is a conservative part to the Constitution, whereby it states that only Congress can do the following, and it gives it several powers that were taken from the states under the Confederacy and given just to the central government. However, the 10th Amendment says, right, whatever was not stated in Article 1, Section 8 and throughout the Constitution and is not covered by the necessary and proper clause, which was a very conservative clause, given more wiggle room to the Central Congress, saying they could also do whatever is necessary and proper in carrying out one of their specifically stated duties and rights. That whatever doesn't fall under those categories, enumerated, specifically given to Congress, or necessary and proper, connected to an enumerated power, is reserved to the states. So hence nothing was said about police forces and fire departments, nothing was said about education and schools. And so hence, according to the 10th Amendment, most people would agree that those are to be state issues that the states can have. And to this day, right, you have some cities and ordinances where you can't spit in public. There are some crazy laws to this very day at the local level. As long as it's not in direct violation of a congressional law, local and state governments still have the right to go their own directions with their own laws. So hence, that's the federal part, okay? And so they decided upon a federal balance between a confederacy and a unitary government. And then the republic, remember, is just like what Montesquieu and before him Aristotle had written, where you have some political offices that are directly elected by the people and directly accountable to those people, right? But not all offices. Other offices like judges, right, Supreme Court justices, etc., were deliberately to be hand-picked elite men, well-educated, known for having a good integrity in their character, so that they don't have to always give in to what's popular and to what the majority want, right? Because sometimes the majority is wrong. The majority for a long period of time in many states was okay with slavery, was okay with disenfranchising women, etc. So at any rate, that's what we devised in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. The Founding Fathers devised a federal republic. But when they met and they wrote this, right, you have some very almost scary quotes from some of the conservative Founding Fathers that said that, you know what, we should just go back to our states and ratify or approve it as assemblymen. And that's like correcting your own paper, right? Having the very guys who wrote the Constitution be the only ones who okay it back in their state's assembly. And so obviously the liberals of that time period, who were for leaning more toward democratic government, holding elites accountable, right? They said, no way. And so now you have a struggle over the ratification process. And so what they decided as a compromise is they would allow each state itself to decide how it was going to decide or not to decide to ratify this new written Federal Republic Constitution of 1787. And so in a couple of the states, it went to a referendum. It went to a popular vote amongst all the citizens. So for that time period, very democratic, right? The majority got to decide if that state wanted or did not want to approve of this Constitution. And they needed 9 of the 13 states to approve it for it to be ratified. But in other states, right, there was a struggle in which the assemblymen began to try to ratify it themselves. And again, these same assemblymen were the ones who wrote it in Philadelphia. So they're correcting their own paper, so to speak, right? So of course they're going to ratify it. They wrote it. And you had unelected guests come in. Massachusetts was a big case in point. In Massachusetts, many different villages and cities and small towns, they elected reps who went uninvited to these assembly ratification conventions and said, hey, I represent Braintree, Massachusetts. I represent Salem, Massachusetts. And my people said, you have to let me into this convention and we get a say over whether this is ratified or not. And almost without exception, what a large pattern was, is these unelected reps who came on behalf of their people, of their environment, their locality, right? Is they gave ultimatums. They said, okay, we'll ratify this. The people in my town say that we'll ratify this Constitution only if you put something in it, you add something in it as far as the protection of our rights against the police powers. What they've been reading with Beccaria, right? The rights of suspects. Others came and said, we're not okay with this unless you issue freedom of the press. Others came in and said, along with Beccaria, we're not okay with this unless you allow trial by juries instead of these elitist judges deciding upon guilt for suspects. And so you could guess, right, where I'm going here is these demands made by the common people, these ultimatums, if you will, saying we will not be okay with this new government unless you concede such and such. They were amalgamated together into the Bill of Rights. So technically, right, the Bill of Rights were not initially written by the Founding Fathers, okay? The Bill of Rights, what we are so proud of, right, that safeguard individual liberties, right, that citizens have. Joy, thank you for joining. They will now, they felt pretty much compelled, according to Pauline Maier in her book, they felt compelled that, well, heck, we want this passed, so we're going to have to give some concessions to these people. And so hence they almost grudgingly in her book wrote the Bill of Rights. Okay, so like I said, with bittersweet is that it paints the founding fathers, the writers of the Constitution, in a pretty negative light, right? It gives them a very elitist image, whereby they just wanted to okay it themselves and they didn't want it given to the people and for their permission. But the people themselves stood up for their rights at these different state ratification conventions and made demands that were put onto paper and added as the Bill of Rights onto the Constitution. So that part of it, right, is romantic in saying that we have a special political tradition in this country whereby the average person, the average citizen, is intolerant of tyranny, is intolerant of aristocracy, of rule by the cream of the crop only, but that they make demands that their voice be heard and that concessions be given to the common people. Okay, so that was her thesis on number 11. All right, historian Pauline Maier on the ratification of our constitutional republic. Do any of you have any questions or comments so far?
No, Professor,
No.
I don't.
Okay, thank you guys. Thank you for your feedback. Even if it's that you don't have a question, I appreciate that. So hence, we have done number 10 for the test. We've done number 11, which are number 10 refers to number 1 in your argumentative assignment this week, and number 11 refers to number 2 in your argumentative assignment this week, right? And then also we've done number 12, state level, quote, democracy during and after the War for Independence. And note I stated examples of that and how it was as if during the War for Independence, we were at the height of being influenced by Scottish liberalism, right, which was libertarian and trusted the people over the elite, and the Enlightenment and having checks and balances to power, natural rights guaranteed to people. Because by the way, our Bill of Rights that supposedly the founding fathers grudgingly gave after the people demanded it, Bill of Rights were already written in several of the colonies. They beat the federal government to the punch. Virginia, for instance, you look up a gentleman named Mason, and his preamble to the Bill of Rights is very, very similar to Jefferson's writings in the Declaration of Independence and so forth, to the point where people say that he borrowed from Mason. Okay, so technically then, number 13, what type of government was devised in 1787? So for one, a constitutional, and that's just very simple, is that instead of the idea right with the Enlightenment and with Scottish liberalism, is that people are prone to be arbitrary as rulers. I think of arbitrary power like the power that you might have over your dog or something, that you could have one set of rules today and change the rules tomorrow. And you could tell your dog, what are you going to do about it? Right? You're at my mercy. So that was a popularly used phrase that the Americans were frightened of, was arbitrary power. Human beings changing things according to their whim, to their changing ideas, to the circumstances that might provoke an emotional response from them, and what rights they may have given the people yesterday, they decide to take away tomorrow. So a constitution, they said, ought to be written that perfectly limits what the government can do and what the government cannot do, right? And a constitution is stable, it's steady for all to read, it plays no favorites, and it's a safeguard for our liberties and rights. So firstly, on number 13, we have a constitutional, and then the next word is federal, and I've already explained that, right? A balance between a loose confederacy of states and a unitary government where DC would dictate everything everywhere. Obviously, we don't have either of those. The federal part is a balance, it's a compromise, so that the states get to retain some of their unique powers and make their own laws and go their own directions, but the federal government has overview over them and has supremacy over them. And like I said, Article 1, Section 8 has direct rights that only Congress can do, and no longer the states. So we have a constitutional, federal, and then the third word is republic, right? And then again, I keep that easy for myself, not condescendingly to you guys, but I just think of Aristotle. He called it generically a mixed government, and so did Montesquieu. A balanced mixed government is what republic implies, is that some reps and some laws will be made by the majority, by those who are elected by the majority of citizens, right? And are hence, when they run for re-election, are accountable to what the majority wants, or they'll be, quote, unelected out of office. And then some offices like Supreme Court justices who can protect the minority, right, from the tyranny of the majority, and do not have to make popular decisions, because sometimes the masses can be wrong, right? And I used as a case in point slavery and black codes against African Americans, which were popular and passed popularly in most of the states, especially in the South. Okay, so that's number 13. We have a constitutional federal republic. All right, and then number 14 on the test What type of economic system did we devise? Well, in the 1770s, what was highly read was the work of Adam Smith, his Wealth and Poverty of Nations book. And he was writing against mercantilism. And remember, mercantilism goes from the assumption that the resources and opportunities for wealth are finite, and it is the right of the king in particular, or queen, to decide how to allocate opportunities and access to resources to whom, right? And so hence, it's a system that was pretty much ensconced in privilege. If you had the right family name, if you had the right connections to the crown, you alone could have a monopoly in trading tobacco to England, or slaves from the Ivory Coast to Virginia, etc. Right? And so Adam Smith wrote against that and said that it's a natural right of human beings to pursue their own perceived self-interest, right? And what he stated, right, was that there are laws of economy, there are laws of human interaction, laws of human psychology, and just laws of economics, right? Because remember, the Enlightenment, it was about deism. Everything is created by like this clockmaker, and there are natural laws by which everything operates. And he stated that, for instance, you see someone who's playing basketball and they're sweating and they're hot. It's a hot summer day, and they're kind of remote from a store of any sort. And he said, you know what? I'm going to go as a little vendor and I'm going to provide them Gatorade, right? And when you get there, you think, okay, yeah, they could buy a Gatorade for $1.35 at the store, but they have no one here to compete with me, so I'm going to charge them $2 for my Gatorade. And I don't really care that they're thirsty. I just care that they will likely be in a position where they will want my Gatorade and make me money. Well, the people playing, right? Well, heck, they say, you know, and we're in a unique situation. If I were to buy a store, I would say no to you. But now you have the opportunity to sell this to me. I want it. I'm thirsty. I don't care about giving you money for you and your family. I just want that Gatorade. And so that's probably a poor example. But he said that there are natural laws by which people can go ahead and be selfish, to give in to their innate selfishness of what they want. And somehow the laws of economics and human interaction and so forth will work so that everyone benefits from it. Okay. And of course, he was promoting, to an extent, laissez-faire capitalism, Laissez, and then Faire. Laissez-faire is let it be, that the government should stay out of it, that there ought to be private access to purchase lands, to start businesses, to hire workers, right, to earn a wage. And the government needs to just stay out of it and let the laws of economics and human interaction do their thing. So there's something egalitarian about that, right? So that everyone's on equal footing. But with our founding fathers, right from the get-go, is that Alexander Hamilton was really big on this, is he stated that we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater with Britain. That yes, we should have no nobility that's recognized here, no official monopolies given to crown favorites anymore, right? No limitations on land, saying that land is only open to members of the general council of the colony, like used to happen. And then the rest of the lands will be left over for everyone else to purchase or squat on. But that we definitely need to go away from England that way and have private competition, private access to buy things, to borrow money, to start businesses, to sell and buy, etc. Right? But he said, however, Britain did have a few things right. Is Britain helped out? They called them nascent. Nascent is like growing like a baby. Nascent industries, because to Alexander Hamilton, he thought that the when you are at the mercy of buying your finished products from a factory from England, you're basically still economically a colonist to them. He didn't want us to become dependent or remain dependent upon England or any other European or other power for goods and services. He wanted us to become self-sufficient, to grow our own stuff, to diversify and have tons of different industries pop up, right? and have them provide for Americans, hire Americans, and have Americans buy their stuff instead of buying British-made products, right? So he cloaked it under necessity and becoming a powerful country and not dependent upon others, and he cloaked it under a sense of just common sense. That's just common sense economics. So hence, with number 14, we devised a capitalist system as opposed to mercantilist, where there's no nobility, no monopolies given to certain people, uh, uh, lack of access to purchasing certain lands or getting loans taken away from some people and only available to others. It's capitalist, but it was never laissez-faire. It was never the government just stay out of it. He wanted the government to help promote new diversifying industries. Okay. And I think I might leave it there because when we get to the early republic, we'll get into examples of how the government was helping big business. I think I'll wait for that for actually 2 assignments from now. Okay. But that's number 14, is we devised a capitalist system, but not laissez-faire. The government was involved from the get-go. Okay? And then number 15, the Federalist Papers, is the idea is in the popular narrative of American history, is when Shays' Rebellion was going on and this drama and the members of the Continental Confederation were discussing and debating laws that needed to be changed and the structure of the government needing to be changed, that the Federalist Papers helped tip those who were undecided toward the conservative side. Okay, so the Federalist Papers are about 87 short philosophical essays written by about 4 or 5 conservatives, namely James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. And John Jay also, who was a Supreme Court justice. So these dudes are conservative, right? And what they did in the Federalist Papers is they tried to allay the fears of the libertarians, of the liberals of their time period, saying, see, for this and this reason, we need to have a stronger centralized Congress that can impose laws by majority vote on all areas and not just the areas where their elected reps said yes to. For this reason, we need a standing army. Don't be afraid of this. So they tried to allay the fears of the liberals and trying to philosophically and use historical instances for their knowledge of history of other civilizations to convey that this was a necessity to go to a less democratic and more centralized federal republic, as opposed to the Confederacy during which they wrote them. Okay? And even Thomas Jefferson, who was an adamant libertarian liberal, he literally went to France. And when the ratification drama was going on, he just kind of stayed away from it. And he could have stayed home and really been an influential opponent to this Constitution, right? And leading people to refuse to ratify it. So some people think that it wasn't just his personality of feeling like ratification was perhaps inevitable, that it was going to pass anyway, whether he wanted it to or not, or the part of his personality that we'll read soon that was very unconfrontational, but also that there was a side to him that he would not admit publicly, that even he kind of inwardly thought, you know what, we kind of do need a stronger, perhaps even less democratic government. And of course, that's argumentative, but that's what some major historians convey. So the Federalist Papers, right, were the philosophical, logical, historical defense of changing from the Democratic Confederation to a less democratic, more centralized federal republic. Okay? And supposedly they were pretty influential for those who were on the fence. All right, so any questions, you guys?
None.
Okay, thank you.
No, Professor.
Okay, good, good, good. So if I did, like I said, I was really sick last week, so I'm relying upon your memory. If I did give you guys a video or do a Zoom, either one, if I gave you a Zoom video for last week, I will have covered numbers 1 through 8 on the War for Independence. So if you have any specific questions, you guys, the three of you, by all means ask me now on numbers 1 through 8. Number 9 I'm skipping because it's out of the textbook. So I want you to get that for the test out of the textbook yourself, okay? But by all means, if you have a question, you want me to reiterate anything from last week's video on numbers 1 through 8, go ahead and throw it at me. If not, I'm going to assume that, like I said, it's already been covered in that video and you guys are good. Anyone who watches this later and is not certain for even listening to the video of what number 4 really entailed, etc., for instance, Canvas message me, okay? And feel free to give me a specific question that you have on a specific test number, and I'm happy to help. Okay, so I have the three of you who are present. Like I said, I'm not penalizing anyone. I understand that some your schedule deters you from being able to come to this, but that to me, and not penalizing them, that's not incompatible with giving extra credit to those who do come here. Okay, and so I have 4 names here that I want to give extra credit to for being here on the video. So any questions before I go ahead and just call on in to this one?
I don't have any question, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
No
Okay,
questions.
thank you.
You're very welcome. So I hope these are helpful, and yeah, you guys are doing really well on the argumentative stuff. And I want to apologize again. I have 3 classes at 2 different schools, Modesto and Delta, and each class literally has over 80 kids. And so I'm rewriting some of these argumentative things and rewriting my tests, and I've been under the weather, so I apologize if I've only corrected a couple of your assignments. I will definitely try to play catch up very soon. But from what I've read and graded, you guys are very intelligent. You do very well in the argumentative sections. I'm proud of you. Okay, so
Thank you.
Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys. So you guys have a good week, okay? And you have any other questions, just go ahead and Canvas message me or message me via my second phone number. All right, so thank you and have a good week, okay?
Thank you, Professor.
Bye.
You too.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.